The earnings of this operation are insufficient, and I've identified no fewer than 3 opportunities for quick expense reductions, announced the gentleman dressed in costly attire, gesturing toward his tablet display. We'll begin with staff salaries. Seated opposite the desk, I remained speechless with shock while Brian Hayes, the newly appointed area director from Betrayal Veterinary Partners, outlined how my 14-year tenure at Oakwood Animal Clinic now merited precisely 60% of my present wages. Don't take it personally, Dr. Langdon. This is simply commerce, he stated with a rehearsed grin. Your salary must be brought into line with what's typical in the field. My identity is Jessica Langdon. At 41 years of age, I've committed my complete career to serving the creatures of Lexington, Kentucky. What began as employment at a modest family-operated animal hospital immediately following veterinary school had evolved into something I invested myself in completely. I was the individual who'd assisted the facility in expanding from a dual-room establishment to the dependable neighborhood institution it had evolved into. I recognize this represents a period of change, I responded evenly despite my racing pulse. When would these modifications begin? Starting with the upcoming payment period, Brian responded, his attention already returning to his device. Your answer is required by this Friday. When elderly Dr. Harrington chose to step down and transfer ownership of the clinic, we'd all experienced anxiety. However, he'd promised us that Betrayal would preserve what the clinic represented. They grasp what we've established here, he'd mentioned at the farewell gathering. Currently, 3 weeks following the completed transaction, I confronted a dilemma between accepting a substantial wage decrease or abandoning the clinic that seemed like my additional residence, where I'd instructed every veterinary assistant, where I recognized countless animals personally, where patrons explicitly asked for my services for their companions' treatment. I'm grateful for your directness, I stated while rising. My answer will reach you before Friday. Brian acknowledged this without raising his eyes. As I approached the exit, he addressed me again. Additionally, Jessica, we're introducing a revised appointment system starting next week. The instruction document awaits you via electronic correspondence. Beyond his workspace, I stopped near the front counter where Valerie was modifying client files. She'd served as our front desk coordinator for 12 years, and her troubled look indicated she'd already received the news. They approached you as well? I inquired softly. She confirmed with a nod. 30% reduction along with fewer working hours. What's your plan? I murmured, conscious of the patrons in the reception area. Valerie observed the households with their cherished companions. An older golden retriever seated calmly alongside an aged gentleman, a lady holding a feline transport container, a youngster stroking a bunny on her knees. I'm uncertain currently, she answered. However, my intuition suggests circumstances are going to shift here and not favorably. A feeling of determination started forming within me. This transcended simply my wages. This concerned everything we'd created, everything we represented. I surveyed the hospital that had constituted my life's accomplishment and understood that action was necessary. I've consistently maintained that excellence in veterinary medicine encompasses more than technical proficiency. It involves connections with creatures certainly, but equally with their caretakers. Throughout 14 years, I'd immunized young dogs and subsequently assisted those identical animals in their final passage. I'd composed personal condolence notes following challenging losses and rejoiced over remarkable healings. My mobile number was stored in numerous household contacts as Dr. Jessica for urgent consultations. My residence walls displayed appreciation notes and photographs of animals I'd cared for. The cooling unit exhibited artwork from youngsters whose pets I'd rescued. These weren't merely patrons. They were relationships that extended profoundly. You've collaborated with Betrayal previously, correct? I questioned Thomas, our most recent veterinarian, over the midday meal the next day. At 32 years old, he'd become part of our team 6 months prior after serving at a commercial clinic in Nashville. He nodded seriously. 3 years duration. It invariably commences identically. Expense reductions followed by productivity enhancements, followed by demands to promote additional procedures. And the treatment standards? I questioned, though I already anticipated his response. Everything transforms into statistics, he answered. The quantity of clients you attend per 60 minutes, the number of extra procedures you market, the amount of income you produce. He moved his greens around. That's the reason I departed. became weary of receiving instructions to suggest needless dental treatments to satisfy monthly objectives. Subsequently that afternoon, during intervals between visits, I contacted Dr. Harrington. Following 3 decades of service, he'd withdrawn to a lakeside cottage where he occupied his days angling and composing the veterinary memoirs he'd perpetually discussed. "I possessed no knowledge of this, Jessica," he expressed, his tone weighted with remorse. "Their delegates guaranteed me they respected the clinic's principles. I never would have transferred ownership had I understood. This isn't your responsibility," I reassured him. "You merited your withdrawal. I simply need to reach a conclusion." "What are you contemplating?" he inquired. I paused. The concept had been developing in my thoughts, but verbalizing it would render it tangible. "I'm evaluating establishing my independent clinic." The quiet on the connection endured merely an instant. "You ought to," he ultimately stated. "You possess the qualifications, the patron connections, and Lexington requires a hospital that continues prioritizing treatment above commercial profits." Following our conversation's conclusion, I remained in my workspace observing the credentials and licenses mounted on the surface. My thoughts wandered to discussions with patrons throughout the years, numerous whom had conveyed their appreciation that we weren't among those production line animal hospitals. My contemplations were disrupted by knocking. It was Maggie, our senior assistant for the previous 8 years. "My apologies for the interruption, Dr. Langdon. However, Mrs. Peterson has arrived with Baxter. She particularly requested your services, despite being technically assigned to Dr. Morris presently." "Inform her I'll arrive momentarily," I stated, standing. As I readied myself to assess the decade-old beagle I'd been managing since his puppy stage, I comprehended what action was required. The choice no longer solely concerned my wages. It concerned maintaining something significant. Friday morning materialized with a lucidity I hadn't experienced in weeks. I had devoted my evenings investigating commercial properties, apparatus expenses, and entrepreneurial financing. I'd contacted 3 previous associates who had effectively founded their independent clinics. The further I investigated the prospect, the more appropriate it seemed. I knocked on Brian's entrance at exactly 9 o'clock. "Enter," he summoned, his tone unfocused. I stepped in to discover him videoconferencing with an individual, his position half-rotated from the entrance. "I'll resume contact shortly," he informed the display before rotating to address me. "Jessica, excellent. Have you reached your conclusion?" "I have," I responded, presenting him an envelope. "This represents my 14-day resignation notification." His corporate facade faltered briefly, displaying authentic astonishment. "You're departing? Because of a routine market correction?" "I'm following a fresh prospect," I amended. "And I desire to notify you appropriately with sufficient time to organize alternative coverage for my clients." Brian reclined in his seat, examining me. "You understand, I anticipated this response from certain support personnel but not from you. You're an experienced veterinarian. This represents how business acquisitions function. Everyone must accommodate. I comprehend commercial realities," I stated deliberately. "And I've executed a commercial determination of my own." He gestured dismissively, already grasping for my departure document. "We'll have human resources arrange your termination documentation. I presume you'll be joining an alternative clinic." "Something of that nature," I responded ambiguously. Word of my departure circulated through the hospital rapidly. Before the midday period, Valerie, Maggie, and Thomas had all discovered opportunities to approach me privately. "Is this accurate?" Valerie questioned, her tone scarcely audible as we positioned ourselves beside the document storage. "Affirmative," I verified. "My concluding day occurs 14 days from now." "What are your intentions?" she insisted. I hesitated before determining to confide in her with the reality. "I'm launching my independent clinic. I've been examining a location on Maple Avenue." Her expression expanded. "Truly? That's..." She surveyed the surroundings and reduced her voice additionally. "That's remarkable, Jessica." Throughout the day, comparable exchanges ensued. Thomas conveyed interest instantly. Notifying me of developments, he communicated significantly during a brief interval between clients. That evening, I positioned myself at my residential table with a notepad, generating inventories and strategies. My device vibrated with correspondence from Maggie. "Whatever your intentions include me. It wasn't until my third warm beverage that the gravity of what transpired earlier affected me. As I was exiting for the day, Mrs. Davidson had intercepted me in the vehicle area. Her feline Oliver had served as my client since she obtained him 6 years prior. I detected one of the assistants stating, "You're departing?" She expressed authentic concern in her tone. "Is this truthful?" When I verified it, her reaction was instant. "Where are your plans?" "Because Oliver and I will accompany you there." That straightforward statement of devotion made me comprehend something I hadn't completely valued previously. I wasn't simply a veterinarian to these individuals and their companions. I was their personal veterinarian. And that connection signified something. Something Brightpaw had severely miscalculated. Observing my documentation, I experienced a revived sense of intention. This no longer solely concerned declining an unjust wage reduction. This concerned establishing something superior, a clinic that would respect the confidence these households had invested in me. The subsequent 14 days constituted the most extended of my profession. I sustained complete professionalism, managing each creature with identical attention I perpetually had. However, an underlying current of strain permeated every exchange with administration. Brian had begun monitoring during my consultations, documentation in possession, recording observations about productivity possibilities. He arranged a departure consultation for my concluding day and transmitted daily notifications about my ongoing responsibility to refrain from soliciting patrons and personnel, a provision that following examination with an attorney acquaintance proved mostly unenforceable in Kentucky. What Brian remained unaware of was that I'd already executed a rental agreement on a commercial space merely 7 minutes distant. The location had previously served as a pediatrician's facility, signifying substantial necessary framework was already present. I'd obtained funding through a neighborhood financial institution where I'd maintained accounts for exceeding a decade, and apparatus vendors I'd collaborated with for years presented advantageous conditions for the fresh clinic. "We appreciate connections as well," my medical vendor representative informed me during a discreet dining meeting, "and candidly, we've observed what transpires to standards when Brightpaw assumes control. We're pleased to assist independent facilities." Within the hospital, I preserved careful silence regarding my strategies, but information was circulating nevertheless. Patrons would pose pointed inquiries during consultations. "So, where precisely will your fresh clinic be situated?" Mrs. Thompson questioned while I assessed her terrier's auditory infection. "I haven't confirmed anything presently," I responded cautiously, cognizant of the recording device on the computer arrangement that had been installed the prior week as component of Brightpaw's standards verification initiative. She reduced her tone. "Well, when you accomplish this, kindly notify me. Max refuses to consult anyone alternative." These discussions transpired daily and each strengthened my determination. I wasn't simply executing a profession transition. I was maintaining a treatment standard that mattered to the population. On Wednesday of my concluding week, Brian summoned me to his workspace again. His comportment had transformed, the business assurance substituted by scarcely hidden frustration. "Multiple patrons have been inquiring about your upcoming strategies," he stated without introduction. "I must remind you of your binding responsibilities." "I recognize my responsibilities," I responded calmly. "And I've been transparent with everyone that I possess no definite strategies to reveal." He tapped his writing instrument against the surface. "We've invested substantially in obtaining this clinic, Dr. Langdon. Brightpaw won't regard favorably any efforts to sabotage that expenditure." "I comprehend," I stated. "Is there additional matters?" He observed me momentarily. "We're willing to reconsider your remuneration arrangement. Perhaps we were excessively forceful with the preliminary modification." The proposition caught me unprepared. It represented the initial indication that perhaps Brightpaw was acknowledging their error in judgment, but it was excessively delayed. The rental agreement was executed, apparatus requested, and my vision for Riverbank Animal Hospital was already materializing. "I value that, Brian, however my determination is finalized." Subsequently that afternoon, Valerie deposited a folded communication onto my surface. Within was an inventory of 20 patron identities with a straightforward message. "These individuals contacted today particularly inquiring about you." At the bottom she'd appended, "When you're prepared to employ a receptionist, contact me initially." That evening, I encountered Thomas and Maggie at a coffee establishment multiple miles from the hospital, sufficiently distant to prevent encountering anyone from Betrayal. Over coffee beverages, I ultimately communicated my strategies comprehensively. I've obtained a site on Riverbank Drive, I informed them. It'll be designated Riverbank Animal Hospital, commencing in approximately 6 weeks if everything advances according to timeline. 6 weeks, Maggie repeated, her look contemplative. My hour reduction becomes effective in 3. Intriguing coordination. Thomas inclined forward. What's your personnel strategy? I require a veterinarian who embraces my treatment philosophy, I stated, encountering his observation directly. And a qualified senior assistant. Their expressions informed me everything I needed to comprehend. Before we departed the coffee establishment, my fresh clinic had unofficially acquired its initial team participants. The components were positioning themselves, but I possessed no awareness that Betrayal was preparing to compel my action in a manner I never expected. My penultimate day at Oakwood commenced with an unwelcome astonishment. Displayed on the staff lounge announcement surface was a revised charge listing effective instantly with cost elevations averaging 30% throughout all procedures. Fundamental immunizations that had been priced $45 were currently $65. Dental treatments increased from $300 to $425. More troubling were the fresh treatment combinations, emphasized prominently, consolidated procedures that incorporated examinations rarely required for healthy creatures. The extensive wellness combination incorporated 3 distinct screenings that most companions simply didn't necessitate at standard consultations. They're not even attempting concealment anymore, murmured Jenna, a young veterinary assistant who had become part of our group immediately before the acquisition. Dr. Morris already instructed me we must suggest the superior combination to every patron presently. My abdomen constricted. This wasn't simply business optimization anymore. This was predatory. When Mrs. Whitaker transported her elderly feline, Chairman Meow, for his joint inflammation assessment, I discovered myself in an unacceptable situation. The revised guidelines mandated me to suggest a complete senior evaluation costing nearly $500 despite having conducted the identical examinations merely 2 months previously. Is this genuinely essential so immediately? Mrs. Whitaker questioned, her worry apparent. Subsisting on a limited pension, she allocated resources carefully for her feline's treatment. The fresh proprietors have instituted standard guidelines, I clarified carefully. However, in my expert assessment, considering Chairman's recent normal outcomes, we could postpone another 4 months for these specific examinations. She appeared relieved, but my accommodation was temporary. Brian had evidently been observing the consultation through the revised electronic arrangement. He accessed the examination space before I could finalize the appointment. Mrs. Whitaker, I'm Brian Hayes, Area Director. He presented himself with a rehearsed grin. I couldn't avoid observing that we haven't arranged Chairman's senior wellness combination presently. What transpired was a demonstration in coercion techniques, subtle suggestions that bypassing these examinations was irresponsible, references to identifying complications early, and ultimately the concluding proposal of a limited unique reduction that continued exceeding what these examinations should genuinely cost. I observed Mrs. Whitaker's look transition from bewilderment to responsibility to acceptance as she ultimately concurred, her hands grasping her handbag somewhat firmer. Following her departure, Brian redirected me aside. Dr. Langdon, when we suggest a guideline, we anticipate our veterinarians to endorse it completely. Those examinations are needless presently, I stated, maintaining my tone reduced but resolute. This isn't regarding healthcare, it's regarding income. This concerns standardized treatment, he responded. Your emotional attachment to patrons is obscuring your expert discernment. I nearly expressed amusement at the absurdity. My emotional attachment to patrons is termed establishing confidence. It's why this clinic has flourished for decades. He verified his timepiece dismissively. Well, fortunately, we only must manage that methodology for 1 additional day. The remainder of the day continued similarly, with Brian monitoring around my consultations and interfering whenever I didn't advance the revised guidelines sufficiently forcefully. Before closing period, I was emotionally depleted. As I was modifying Chairman Meow's documentation, I observed something that made my circulation cease. Within the annotations section, an administrative entry stated, "Patient reassignment to Dr. Morris effective instantly. Dr. Langdon no longer designated veterinarian." A rapid verification of multiple other longtime clients disclosed the identical modification. They were redistributing all of my clients before I'd even exited. That night I couldn't achieve rest. I'd strategized to exit quietly, allocate myself duration to establish my fresh clinic, and only subsequently inform patrons of my fresh site. However, Brightpaw's forceful methods and readiness to manipulate patron confidence transformed everything. At 2:00 morning, I executed a determination. I positioned myself at my computer and composed correspondence to the attorney who'd been assisting me establish my fresh clinic. "Must expedite schedule," I composed. "How immediately can we commence, even in restricted function?" Her reaction arrived surprisingly rapidly. "With provisional apparatus rental and inventive arrangement, potentially 14 days. Contact me during morning hours." I closed my portable computer, ultimately able to decompress sufficiently to rest. Tomorrow would constitute my concluding day at Oakwood Animal Clinic, and it wasn't going to proceed the manner Brian Hayes anticipated. My terminal day materialized with a feeling of both conclusion and commencement. I devoted the early morning hours arranging, executing contacts, and establishing matters in progression. Currently, as I position my vehicle in my customary location for the final occasion, I experienced strangely tranquil. The morning advanced with a sequence of emotional farewells from personnel participants who'd evolved into household throughout the years. Even certain of the more recent personnel who scarcely recognized me appeared influenced by the transformation in the hospital's environment. "The arrangement appears minimal presently," Valerie observed when I stopped by reception. Indeed, I possessed only 4 consultations, unusual for a Friday. Brian restricted most of my day for transition activities, I clarified. Evidently, I possessed substantial documentation to finalize before I exit. What neither of us articulated was that my consistent patrons had already been reallocated among the remaining veterinarians. At midday, Brian requested me to the discussion space for what he termed a departure guideline assembly. I anticipated the customary termination consultation formalities, surrendering access devices, executing final documentation, perhaps a superficial recognition of my years of contribution. Instead, I discovered Brian positioned with 2 individuals I'd never encountered previously. One was presented as Brightpaw's area legal representative, the alternative as their personnel relations supervisor. "Before we execute your departure, we must address certain worries," Brian commenced, his tone ceremonial. "It's reached our awareness that you may be strategizing to establish a rival clinic in breach of your employment conditions." The legal representative, a severe lady in her 50s, transferred a document across the surface. "This represents a cessation and prohibition correspondence regarding any strategies to conduct veterinary medicine within a 20-mile perimeter of this establishment for the duration of 1 year." I observed the document but didn't contact it. I don't recall executing any restrictive employment agreement. It's integrated in the transition documents all personnel executed when Brightpaw obtained the clinic, she responded smoothly. "Actually," I stated, accessing my container, "I possess duplicates of everything I executed. There was no restrictive employment provision in any of those documents." I positioned my personal documentation on the surface. My attorney verified this yesterday. The environment in the space transformed noticeably. Furthermore, I continued, Kentucky legislation substantially restricts the enforceability of restrictive employment agreements for medical experts, incorporating veterinarians, particularly when client welfare is threatened. The attorney and personnel supervisor exchanged observations. Brian's assured look wavered. "We're not here to dispute legalities," Brian stated rapidly. "We simply desire to guarantee a smooth transition for our patrons." "Your patrons," I amended gently. "And I concur completely about guaranteeing their treatment isn't interrupted." The personnel supervisor, evidently detecting in prospect to reduce tension, adopted a conciliatory approach. "Dr. Langdon, I comprehend you've been with this clinic for numerous years. Perhaps we can identify a compromise that functions for everyone." I expressed pleasure. I'm perpetually receptive to rational solutions. What transpired was 2 hours of discussions that ultimately resulted in a straightforward arrangement. I would refrain from actively recruiting Oakwood's patrons for a duration of 30 days, and in return, Betrayal would abandon any assertion to limit my clinic site or schedule. Before we concluded, I had formally terminated my position at Oakwood Animal Clinic. I gathered my individual possessions, expressed my terminal farewells, and proceeded to my vehicle with a combination of sentiment and enthusiasm. As I was exiting the vehicle area, my device signaled with correspondence from Valerie. Just detected Brian on the telephone with headquarters. He expressed she's merely one veterinarian. How substantial impact could her departure possibly generate? I expressed pleasure at her correspondence and composed a rapid response. I suppose we'll discover. What Brian and Betrayal didn't comprehend was that I wasn't simply departing. I was already 2 stages advanced. The mechanisms were in progression and nothing would prevent what was approaching subsequently. Riverbank Animal Hospital commenced operations precisely 17 days following my departure from Oakwood. The schedule had been ambitious, necessitating continuous labor, provisional apparatus rentals, and a minimal staff executing dual responsibilities, but we accomplished it. Thomas became part of me as the secondary veterinarian. Maggie joined as our senior assistant following her hours at Oakwood were diminished to partial duration. Valerie submitted her resignation the day the fresh reception counter was established, referencing Betrayal's aggressive employment environment in her departure document. Our initial day was intended to be a preliminary commencement, an opportunity to evaluate arrangements with a limited number of consultations before a proper initiation the subsequent week. I'd only individually contacted approximately 20 longtime patrons whose companions possessed ongoing medical requirements that I'd been supervising. At 8:45 morning, 15 minutes before our formal commencement, I observed through the front aperture to an astonishing vision. A formation of individuals and companions extended across our modest vehicle area and along the pathway. Did you contact all these individuals? Thomas questioned, expression expanded. Negative, I stated, amazed. I only reached several with urgent requirements. Valerie was already at the reception counter, accessing our fresh clinic administration arrangement. I believe information circulated, she stated with an understanding expression. As we commenced the entrances, recognizable countenances entered. Mrs. Peterson with Baxter the Beagle. The Garcas with their 3 rescued felines. Mr. Johnson and his ancient tortoise Methuselah. Patrons I'd attended for throughout years, even decades in certain instances. We observed on the population social media platform that you were commencing presently, clarified Mrs. Peterson. Nobody desired to overlook it. Before midday period, we documented exceeding 70 companions in our fresh arrangement. Before closing, that quantity had more than duplicated. Every patron possessed the identical communication. They accompanied their veterinarian, not the hospital identity. What affected me most were the modest expressions of assistance. Patrons transported homemade baked goods, congratulation notes, and modest presents for the fresh clinic. One household even materialized with pizza for the personnel midday meal. That evening, as we ultimately secured the entrances following an exhausting but exhilarating day, I obtained correspondence from a previous associate still serving at Oakwood. Urgent assembly summoned for tomorrow morning. Evidently, the arrangement is suddenly vacant. The subsequent week exceeded even my most favorable estimations. We rapidly had to expand our hours and employ additional personnel to accommodate the influx of clients. Before the conclusion of our initial month, we had documented exceeding 800 companions in our arrangement, approximately 70% of Oakwood's previous patron foundation. What astonished me most wasn't the quantity of patrons who accompanied us, but rather how they located us. We had executed minimal promotion, depending primarily on verbal communication and a straightforward notification in the neighborhood publication. Yet, patrons continued arriving, frequently referencing that they'd received information about us from acquaintances, community members, or population social media assemblies. The community companion assemblies have been active about your fresh location. One patron informed me as I assessed her Labrador puppy. Everyone's discussing how you resisted that business organization. I hadn't intended to evolve into a representation of opposition against business veterinary treatment, but somehow that account had established itself. Individuals communicated experiences about their encounters with Betrayal's revised pricing and guidelines, contrasting them with our transparent charges and personalized methodology to treatment. 3 months following commencement, I obtained an unexpected attendee. Dr. Harrington, my previous instructor and the prior proprietor of Oakwood, arrived to examine the fresh clinic. I had to observe it personally, he stated, surveying the surroundings with unconcealed approval. You've established something exceptional here, Jessica. As we proceeded through the hospital, personnel and patrons acknowledged him warmly, numerous conveying how substantially they missed him, but how satisfied they were with the fresh clinic. I executed an error transferring to Brightpaw, he acknowledged quietly as we concluded the examination. I should have contacted you initially. Everything functioned out as it should, I reassured him. Subsequently that day I obtained correspondence that transported everything complete rotation. It was from Brian Hayes requesting an assembly to examine the veterinary environment in Lexington. I expressed pleasure as I composed my reaction. I'm available subsequent Tuesday at 2 p.m. Nothing personal, simply commerce. Surveying the surroundings at the flourishing clinic we'd constructed, populated with animated tails, vibrating clients and the team I confided in, I comprehended that sometimes the optimal response isn't simply achievement, but establishing the location you were perpetually intended to operate.